Good morning, everyone. My name is Elaine Shah. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for 52 Limited. 52 Limited is a creative and tech staffing agency. We, during this time, like everybody else, are trying to be agile and trying to be, to make sure that we're doing the best for our talent and for our clients. And one of those things that has been impacted by COVID-19 is the onboarding process. Kristen and I were chatting earlier, usually when you start your first day, no matter what company, no matter what job, there's some type of welcome, a card, a cup of coffee, maybe pizza lunch, a time for you to meet your team, to really engage with your boss or your manager. And now that we're in this time, everybody's working remote. And so there's not that connection, and onboarding has changed dramatically. So we were fortunate enough to get Kristen to join us for this webinar. She is in the midst of fundraising for her company. She is the founder of Edify. They are a software, you're working on the software for onboarding for software engineers. She used to also be a consultant for learning and development teams, so has worked with many HR teams in her past. And I think that her product and her company is really, really going to make an impact, especially as the future of what work is like is still very unknown. I think a lot of people are really enjoying working remotely, and I think that future is probably going to stick around for some companies and for some teams where it makes sense. So just really wanted to get Kristen's opinion and understand her process as she shares it with her clients, so that we can better understand how to onboard teams, regardless of the type of team they are, because I think it's so important to the future of that person's, and their stake in the company and their engagement with the company. So I'm really excited to have Kristen join us today, and want to thank her very much for her time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Elaine. And I love that we have kind of a small, intimate group today, because that gives me more opportunity to kind of talk with you, engage. We can have more dialogue about what's going on in your team, and kind of have a more active conversation than sometimes there's 20 plus people on these kinds of calls. So this is excellent. So let me go ahead and share my screen. We'll go ahead and get started. All right, and now I have to rearrange Zoom because it gets all fussy when you share your screen. All right, can everybody see everything?
Yes.
Yes. Awesome. Okay, so we are going to talk about onboarding an engineering team successfully today, but to be really honest, this is applicable for all teams. I just happen to kind of focus and specialize in engineering, and that is what my company does, as Elaine mentioned. We used to, I've ran a company from 2014 to the beginning of 2020, focusing on learning and development with a specialty in software engineering onboarding. We had the chance to build for a lot of local companies like Puppet and Elemental, and Cloudability, and all kinds of fun companies here. But we also, and forgive me, we also built for companies all over the world. Adidas and OpenSky Alibaba and CB Insights and all kinds of fun companies. And so we took our learning and sort of everything that we had gathered from that experience from those 6 years, and actually built software out of it for this particular group of people. There's a lot of onboarding software out there that's really excellent, like Sapling, many others, a lot of HRIS tools that you might be familiar with have an onboarding component to them. But what we found was actually that the onboarding components of those bits of software actually didn't solve the need for engineering. And before we even dive in, I kind of want to ask the group a question. I'm curious, kind of at your organization, either now or one that you've worked at in the past, do you have kind of separate onboarding for kind of company level? Everybody joins your company and they all get the same kind of onboarding, and then technical for marketing or technical for engineering or sales, something that is specific to that organization. Do you have something like that? Tell us a little bit about what that looks like at your organization.
Stream does have something like that now because we do have a parent company where you get onboarded through that, and then everything is more centrally based as to what department they're going to.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll have like a different list of instructions based on if they're engineering or if they're product or something different.
Awesome. That's great to hear. Yeah. What about anybody else on the call? What do your organizations look like? And you can also use the chat too.
Okay, this is Elena. So when I used to work for Intel several years ago, yes, Intel had in place some software, but in reality, so my team was mostly engineering team. They worked on mathematical library. So, and there were so many specific things that the new employee supposed to do, like getting access to different databases, using different software. So I was in charge to create some kind of manual guides and track all that using some, something hands-on other application, but I didn't use anything which would unite all the aspects in one place. But it was maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah.
From now.
Yeah.
Maybe something changed.
Yeah. Things probably have changed, as they often do in these kinds of organizations. But what you're describing, frankly, is pretty common even now. There are lots and lots of different types of documentation and expectations and places to go find information. And it's often really hard once an employee sort of graduates out of their orientation. And I think about orientation as sort of day one, here's your payroll benefits, security, compliance, get to know the company history, values, things like that. After they kind of graduate out of that, oftentimes they're kind of just pushed into the deep end of the pool in their specific department. And so that's what we wanted to solve for at Edify. So we are going to kind of deep dive on engineering today, but you can actually use these same principles everywhere else too. All right, so I do have a worksheet for you. If you go to this URL, https://tinyurl.com/y658HH03, or excuse me, yes, 03, not 03. That is going to get you to a worksheet. So I'll give you just a minute to make sure that you can grab that and make sure it's working for you. Are we able to access that?
Yes, that works for me.
Excellent. Okay. And it should be such that you are a viewer and you are more than welcome to make a copy of it. So you just go to File, Make a Copy, and then you can adjust it the way that you need. So this is something that you might find useful as we go through this process. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our goals today. So I want to make sure that you walk away kind of knowing and understanding the impact that great onboarding really can have on your organization and how much it's actually costing your organization to not have necessarily up to snuff good engineering onboarding. Second goal, I want you to be able to develop your own plan of action for building your onboarding program. And third, learn some of the best practices for engineering onboarding that really is truly scalable. There's a lot of engineering organizations that we've worked with in the past that have really extensive in-person training. They might have boot camps, they might have sort of multiple labs. And obviously, as we all know, that's just not possible today, right? And as Elaine mentioned, we're all getting kind of Zoom fatigue, and it's really tough to put somebody on video for an entire day. And so we need to talk a little bit about how to scale some of the things that we have tried in the past and change where they're not working today. So that's what I want to work on. Is there anything that is not on this goals list today that you do want to make sure you get out of the call today that you want me to be aware of? Or any kind of questions that you're worried that we won't address? Nope. Okay, excellent. Again, feel free to ask questions at any time. I don't need you to hold them to the end. So jump right in, and I'll ask you a lot of questions as well. Okay, so we're going to first start with defining our challenge. We're going to identify where kind of engineering intersects with actually their ability to ship products and do their job. Core components of onboarding. I kind of call this optimizing the human and automating the rest. because you do want to have really great human relationships developing in your team, but there's a lot that you can automate. And then mobilizing your team. How do you actually get this done? Okay, so let's start with that, defining the challenge. So some of you might know this, but developers are pretty expensive, right? But on top of that, about a third of all new hires, not just engineers, but a third of all new hires begin looking for a new job before they are even done onboarding in their first 3 months. That's crazy to me. But engineering specifically, turnover costs have about about 3 times that employee's salary if you lose them in 18 months, 12 to 18 months. And on top of that, engineers have 2 times the overall turnover rate of non-engineering employees. So, and these are national numbers from Gartner, Harris, and LinkedIn surveys as well. And then finally, developer onboarding is complex. It generally takes about 7 to 9 months for a new engineer to become truly fully productive, which is a lot longer than most people think in their gut. A lot of engineering managers will tell you, oh, it takes like 2 to 4 weeks for them to get up to speed. But then when we actually go in and test that, it takes really 7 to 9 months. So you really want to get them productive faster, because again, if they're taking 9 months to get productive, but they're going to turn over in 18 months, which is the average tenure of an engineer today in this country, you're only getting half of their tenure where they're actually producing good work. And all of this really means that the industry at large has a $22 billion engineering churn problem. So we definitely want to keep our engineers. We want to make it easy for them to stay and be excited to work and to do good work. So that's what it's all about. So a few years ago, Edify did a survey with lots of engineering individual contributors, so not engineering managers, and we asked them, how would you improve onboarding? And these are some of the things that came up again and again. They want to know the culture. They want to understand how employees are working at this company. They want to know their team, right? They want to get one-on-ones, not have to walk in and figure out who to talk to. They want to understand what their responsibilities are going to be, especially for their first 3 months. Having a little bit of process. This is a very obvious one, but have a laptop for them. I think this is actually somewhat harder in remote land, right? Because you can't necessarily control. Many of us on the call are probably used to being able to, get their desk ready and put something nice on the desk and welcome them and have everything ready. And that's just not possible today anymore, right? So we have to kind of retool some of our processes from an HR and a workplace and even an IT standpoint to make sure that we can get this new hire kind of comfortable on their first day, because their desk at home is their new office, right? And then of course, clear tasks, right? So these are things that engineers are asking for. The survey kind of went to really tiny startups of 10 people, but it also went to organizations with 500 engineers on staff. So this is from a very broad sweep of engineers. I bet nothing on here is surprising to you, but is there anything on here that's sort of interesting or that you hadn't heard before?
I'm actually still kind of shocked from your first slide about how quick how
still
much
in shock.
turnover there is. Do we think that turnover is as high as it is because people are not experiencing some type of onboarding process, or is it just because software engineers tend to want to be challenged and want to move to bigger and better places?
Yeah, that's a great question. So both of those two things are reasons. So this data, the reasons that were cited were no onboarding, not a challenging enough environment, and bad manager, right? And bad manager, I'm going to put in quotes. I like to stick up for the manager. I think a lot of times we promote people into management and we do not give them the training that they need to become a great manager. So
Absolutely.
It's not so much, I've never met really like a malicious manager, thankfully, but people who might not be skilled or might not have the tools that they need to be a great manager. That still means that they might not be managing well, and it could be a not so great or a toxic even environment for that person, engineer or otherwise. So definitely onboarding is not the only cause of churn or lack of onboarding, but it is a big cause. That's a really good question. And one of the big things, if you dig a little deeper in that, onboarding is the place where acculturation happens, right? It's the place where engineers really learn the philosophy of the engineering environment that they're working in. They learn how their team works. They learn kind of what the culture of the company really is like in practice. And if you don't have some guardrails, AKA your onboarding program, set up, then they're not going to be able to acculturate. And then if somebody doesn't acculturate, to use a kind of a metaphor, it's like a blood transfusion of the wrong kind of blood, right? The body is going to reject it, right? So they're not going to be happy. The company is not going to be happy. It's going to be a mismatch, right? So that's why we want to invest in our onboarding program to decrease that chance that they would churn out, right? Okay, so let's talk about core components. Now, there's something in software, some of you may be familiar, called test-driven development. And I'm going to simplify it, but it is basically a methodology of writing a type of code that is easily tested. That's why it's test-driven development. So it means that they can write a little bit of code, test it, write and see what's broken, write a little bit more. And it's a nice, affordable way to write software. And it's actually a really great model for onboarding, especially for those of us who are busy. If I could see your hands and ask you, I bet you would raise your hand and say, there's a lot on your plate, a lot going on. So just so that this is something, you might bring back to your engineering team and be like, okay, I understand you guys are probably using test-driven development. I want to do onboarding in the same kind of way. So what happens in test-driven development is they write just enough code to pass a test that they wrote. Then they refactor it, which means to really optimize and to clean it up. They might add a little bit new things, but they might not add new functionality yet because they want to test and make sure that that first feature is ready. And then they write a test that it will fail, and they keep trying it again. That is how they add new functionality in this particular methodology. And that's actually what we're going to do with onboarding. I call this retention-driven development. So it's a little bit different. But basically, this is the same sort of methodology. I want you to kind of start with collecting the documentation, the basic docs for your MVP, your minimum viable product of your onboarding program. So one of the things that I have observed from working with HR teams all over the world for the last 7 years, HR folks I love, and also tend to be a little perfectionist and want to make sure that this is a really good experience for their employee, right? I'm sure that all of you on the call can relate to this. And sometimes that means that HR teams don't want to publish something, or they don't want to push it out until it's ready. And when you're working in software, nothing is ready. It's always in flux. It's always changing. And so if you wait until it's perfect, it's actually going to be out of date. And so that's why this test-driven, retention-driven model is really good for us, because it actually relieves the pressure on our team as people team or HR team. It relieves the pressure of having to be perfect and having it to, be sort of marketing ready, right? And frankly, our engineering team of all teams, they don't need it to be pretty. They don't need it to be perfect. They just want some of that structure, right? So we're going to start by, and we'll walk through each of these things. We're going to start by collecting some of the things that we already have, right? Working with our engineering team to find out what are the basics that you already have written down. Let's gather that up. Then we'll onboard somebody and tell them, okay, update this with a few more links, clean it up, add a little bit more context, then let your new hire find those failure points and keep going, right? You can actually engage your new hire in this process to help you fix your onboarding program, right? Because they're the ones that are coming in with fresh eyes, right? So this is kind of a strange, if you're not familiar with test-driven development, this might be kind of a strange model and you're still wrapping your head around it. What kind of thoughts do you have hearing about this model of test-driven development and how we're going to use it in onboarding?
Would that scare off a new hire at all, at the fact that we don't have things perfected before they come?
I don't think so at all. I think that actually what I have seen from companies, and I've advised companies to do this and seen success out of it, is that when you tell a new hire, we are not perfect. We don't have it completely together. We have a little bit, but we actually want you to help us find what's wrong and help us fix it, that actually gives the new hire some ownership, and it gives them this really fun task to work on. And my product director, Jamie, at our company, Edify, she likes to say your new hire is actually best positioned for this because they are the ones who have the fresh eyes. They are the ones who have the time. They don't have big projects yet because they're not really embedded into anything immediately. And I think it's really about framing. You know, if you sold your company to this person in the recruiting process and you were like, we are perfect and we have everything ready and it's all just, you know, waiting for you to dive in, and then they come and you don't have an onboarding program, then that would scare me off. Then that would frustrate me, right? But if you tell them, you know, we're a startup, we're growing, it's changing, things are shifting, even at the Intels and the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, that is true, right? Things are growing and changing all the time, right? And so I just like to disclose to a new hire, you know, this is not 100% done, and it's probably never going to be 100% done. So I'm really open to your feedback about it. And then when you ask for that feedback, though, you have to really be open to receive it and to adjust it. So I have never seen it scare somebody off, Audrina, but I can totally see kind of the fear of that. Do you have some thoughts about, oh, sorry, go ahead, Alina.
Yeah, I have. So how do you apply this workflow to different teams? For example, this might work, so we could create it for the whole organization, but every engineering team has its own specifics, which should be taken into account. So for this smooth transition. So
yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we're going to get to that point in just a moment. The sort of differences between different engineering teams, right? Because you might have product 1 and product 2, or feature set 1, feature set 2, things like that. So you might have different teams. The last thing I want to say, and so I will answer that question, Elena, but the last thing I want to say about retention-driven development is this is a philosophy. It's a mindset. I want you to think minimum viable program, iterative. We are improving it every time a new hire comes. And it's actually employee-driven. I want you to give your new hire the ownership to help you adjust this and help you make it a really good program. And then finally, it's automated. I want you to look for places to make your life easier and make your managers' lives easier. And we can talk about what that means too. So let's talk about those elements. And this is getting to Elena's question. So there are actually 4 different types of knowledge and skills that everybody in your organization needs to know, but it's going to be specific for the team that they work on. So I want you to imagine, I don't know if you're cake people, but if you like cake, imagine a 3-layer cake, whether it's, you know, red velvet or strawberry, whatever you want. The top layer of this 3-layer cake is corporate onboarding. And if you don't want to use that term corporate, you can say company onboarding. This is HR, it's, you know, benefits, payroll, company history, values, diversity and inclusion, all of that good stuff. And everybody is going to get a slice of that cake. The second layer is departmental, right? Engineering, for example, or marketing, for example. And then the third layer is team, right? So when we slice our cake, you know, let's say that Lyndall and I do work at the same place. She and I are going to get the same Edify top layer, but she and I work on different teams, kind of. Lyndall is our marketing team, not just one person, but she is the marketing team. And then I work in sort of operations and admin as our CEO, right? So we're so small, you know, we have fewer than 5 people. So we're so small that we don't really have big departments or even big teams, but we're going to have slightly different onboarding. And that might matter more when you start to get to bigger teams, when there's 2 or 3 people working in the same team in one organization, right? So let's dig into what those kind of knowledge and skills actually are. So the first one is professional expectations. And I jokingly tell people, this is what you fire people for, or this is what you wish you could fire people for. It's actually the unspoken, tacit things that I want you to make explicit, but they're often not explicit. They're things like dress code, how we behave, how we deal with failure, what to ask when, to whom. You know, do we have an ethics hotline? Do we have all of these sort of ways that we expect to behave? In engineering specifically, there's a lot of sort of difference between engineering team to engineering team. They might write code differently. They might actually, maybe nobody turns their video on during an engineering call, right? That's their practice. That's their professional expectation. These are the communication practices, things like that, that are very intangible, but, think about, and this is kind of, not something we like to think about, but think about when you have worked with somebody who, did not, maybe they were doing from a performance standpoint, they were doing their job fine, but they didn't really mesh well with the team because they were behaving in a way that was not great for the team, right? Maybe they were hoarding information, so knowledge hoarding. Maybe they had toxic behaviors. These are oftentimes, those reasons are the opposite of the professional expectations that you want to talk about with your new hires. And I tell people, you cannot expect something of someone if you don't tell it to them, right? It's not fair to hold someone accountable if they don't know, right? So if you didn't onboard your engineer into this way of communicating or this way of writing code, then when she kind of doesn't do it that way, you kind of can't be mad, right? You can't, it's not time for a performance improvement plan. It's time for you to kind of go back and figure out like, okay, we didn't communicate with you. Let's reset expectations, right? So you can avoid all that pain and frustration and pips and all those awful things if we tell it to them during onboarding, right? So professional expectations is number one. Number two is process. This is how we do the things that we do, right? So for engineering in particular, often we call this the software development lifecycle. So how do we ship software? Do you go here first? Do you do this first? And this is getting really technical. This is where it kind of starts to deep dive into team specific behaviors, right? The next one is product, right? I want to tell you a story. A few years ago, I was working with a client of mine, and I had not even been hired yet, but I came into their office here in Portland, and they had 13 engineering managers around the table, and they had actually flown their HR business partner from London to have this meeting. I didn't realize walking in. And it was just supposed to be an hour-long meeting, and it became a 2.5-hour-long meeting. And here's why. During that meeting, the HR business partner, spent basically an entire hour explaining that they already had engineering onboarding because they had a PowerPoint about the product. And it was sort of more like, here are the basics of the product. And it was a great PowerPoint. We actually looked at it in that meeting. And it looked excellent, but it was for the entire company. It was really for, like, if you're in marketing, here's how you can talk about the product. If you're in sales, here's the basics of the product. So that we're all on the same page. But what engineers need is a bigger deep dive, that is really technical about the product. What's the way that it works? How does it work? Why does the customer use it? All of those sorts of things. So the reason I bring up that story is because sometimes there's resistance to actually building the onboarding that is technical to your team. And there really is a difference in the level of information that, say, somebody working in accounting might need versus somebody working in engineering. Now, you put your engineer through your accounting onboarding and it will make them so super angry and frustrated. So it doesn't, it goes both ways, right? It's not that one onboarding is better than another, or that one team needs more than another team. Every team needs this. Like what I said in the beginning, you can use this same framework for every single organization, right? We just happen to be talking about engineering. And then the final one is technical, and you can call this stack or tooling. It is the tools that the team uses to actually build the product and do their work. So do we use DynamoDB or do we use MongoDB? Do we use Kubernetes? Do we use AWS or do we use Google Cloud or Azure? So there's all kinds of different tools, and each team is going to have their own stack of tools, right? And you've got to tell that to your engineering team. And then the last kind of element of retention-driven development, this sort of onboarding methodology I want you to think about, is drip learning. So how many of you have gotten like an email list of links of things that it's like, these are the things you need to know, welcome to the team, and it's just like a barrage of information. Maybe you've gotten that, maybe you've seen it happen. That is extremely common for engineering. So an engineering manager is busy, just like you. They're trying to do a good job with onboarding. They go around to, whether it's their wiki or the other intranet tool like Confluence, and they look for, okay, what are the most, recently updated documents that I want to share with my new hire? And they basically paste a list of those links into an email or into a Google Doc. Maybe it goes into a checklist that's a little more built out, and it all goes to the new hire all at the same time, right? So imagine this new hire is walking in the door, and actually, instead of walking through your front door, they walk into a brick wall. That is what a list of links really is, right? It has no context. It doesn't actually help them from an adult learning standpoint. So here's where you get to put on your real people experience hat and think about what's the best way for somebody to actually learn this information. And adults actually learn best through context-driven drip learning. So we don't need to know item Z before we know A, B, and C, right? So that is why Edify has sort of made the software that we have the way that we do it. We don't give everything to the new hire on day one. We spread it out over 30 days. Now, that is why, if I go back, that's why we want automated processes. So if you are using a tool like Sapling or another tool that you have, an HRIS tool, or you're using Edify for your engineers, that's going to allow you to automate this process, because it's really like, how are you supposed to remember, oh gosh, okay, so Nathan started on yesterday, so today I'm going to send him these links, tomorrow. I don't want you to do that. That's not at all what I want you to do. And going back to our MVP style, we're not going to get to drip learning yet, right? Because our first version of our technical onboarding program really is a list of links. That is better than nothing. But as you get more involved in this process, you're going to be able to automate it. So, okay, how do we actually make this happen? Actually, before we talk about how to make it happen, let's talk about questions. So, Elena, when you asked about kind of different teams, does this feel like it answered your question?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Okay.
Kristen, will you remind us what RDD stands for?
Absolutely. RDD is retention. I guess I don't have it written down. Retention-driven development. And that is a kind of a pair to test-driven development. It's kind of specific to, it's just a little play on words for engineering, but it works for everybody. Audrina, I'm curious, would this work for your team, do you think?
Yeah, I really do think that it would. A few of the questions that I was thinking of is in the beginning when you said to kind of like ask them on things that they've missed or questions that they might have. How would you recommend doing that? Like, should that be a survey? Should that be a one-on-one? How do you recommend getting that information?
That's a great question. So I think there's pros to each variety, kind of in person and survey. One of the pros of a survey is that you have documented, evidence over time, so you can see things shifting with each new hire. And that's really nice. You can do that if you do one-on-ones, but one-on-ones tend to be a little more free-flowing. But one-on-ones also are a great place to develop cultural conversation and to develop a relationship with someone. And so what I might recommend actually is starting with a survey. Maybe they get a survey at the end of week 1. How was your first week? Then they get a survey at the end of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And if there's something on there that you see that's a recommendation, or they were frustrated with something, it's something kind of an outlier, then I would book a one-on-one with them and say like, hey, I'm so grateful for your feedback. I'd love to dive in and just learn a little bit more. And so that gives you the best of both worlds.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I think we got RDD, what that stands for. Excellent. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about actually mobilizing your team. So, I don't want you to do this on your own. I actually want you to empower your engineering team to help you with it. Okay, so you've got your worksheet, and everybody has access to their worksheet. So again, you can make a copy of this. The way that I like to do this is just set up kind of a 15-minute weekly onboarding prep for yourself. And I would encourage you to get one of your engineering managers on that call with you. It's a tiny commitment, but you can get so much done in 15 minutes if you have a strong agenda. And so the first 15 minutes, maybe you want to do that this week or next week. The first 15 minutes might be, okay, what's everything on your mind today that you think a new hire should know? And just write it into a quick checklist and go find that documentation and link it. And then what about next week? You know, keep adding to it and do that retention-driven process. So if you go into your worksheet, it talks a little bit, you know, it references some of the expense that we talked about earlier. There's also a link to a calculator. You can make a copy of that page as well and actually put your own data in about the salary, the benefits, all that good stuff. You can see how much it's actually costing you. And then you'll be able to get the original talk slides for this as well. And then there's sections of the worksheet too. So moving forward, what I want you to think about doing is actually engaging your engineering team to help you. So the best way to do that is to actually go to them and ask, how is onboarding working for you right now? Because we don't want to assume that it's not working well, right? Maybe they have a plan, maybe they have it working just fine. But we have to kind of go with an open mind, right? What might they need help with, and how would they like support from the people team, the HR team, right? So ask them questions like, do you have the right tools? Are you able to delegate some of the development of that system? Is it going to be your job to do that? Is it going to be an assistant's job? Things like that. I would encourage you to look at the systems that you might already be using today and see if you can use some of them. So is anybody using an HRIS tool or an onboarding tool today?
We use a few different ones.
Okay. Do you mind if I ask what tools you use?
I'm trying to remember all of them. I know that we use Workday.
Workday, okay.
And then we use just a couple like DIY things that we
Okay,
have put
cool.
together.
Yeah, so I think that Workday has, if I'm remembering, I think they have an onboarding module. I'm not sure if it comes standard or if it's something that you have to add in. But if you have something like that, this is also a way to build out your MVP retention-driven development process, right? Where, you know, do a first version, onboard a new hire through it and see what they think about that, right? And that when you're doing this sort of first time MVP, that is, to Audrina's point or question earlier, you know, that's a great time to be asking them in person rather than survey, right? So get that kind of first blush feedback from them. And then consider thinking about this as a big change for your organization. So one of the challenges that I saw while I was consulting for the last 6 years is that even the smallest process change can be scary in an organization, right? Even something that, you know, you're like, this is going to make everybody's life easier, it's going to be better, but change is hard for all of us. Humans don't really like change. And so rather than get frustrated, let's say if somebody kind of rejects your change, I can give you an example. When I was consulting for Elemental, at the time, they were not hiring, back in 2015, they were not hiring super frequently. It was like 1 or 2 people a month. And then they got acquired by AWS and it was like 20 people a month. And the sort of lack of a rule, or the rule was you can hire anybody anytime, right? So they can start on Tuesday, they could start on Friday. And I kind of got in there and we were hiring so quickly that it was actually hurting the team to have people coming in at these different times, right? Because each new hire is going to ask the same set of sort of quote unquote dumb questions because they don't have the context, because they're at the beginning, there was no onboarding plan. And so they were basically wasting a lot of time of the senior engineers, because that's kind of how an engineer learns, is to go and ask the next person. So I said, well, why don't we just put one day every week where you can have people start, right? You can always have people start on Mondays, and you can't have people start Tuesday through Friday. And some engineering managers lost their minds. Let me tell you, it was very challenging. And so what I ended up needing to do was actually sit down with every engineering manager. There were kind of 4 or 5 in particular, I remember, that were vehemently opposed to this idea, and come with a tool that I like to use called Humble Inquiry. You might be familiar with that. It's from Edgar Schein. And it sort of takes Socratic questions a step further. So come with true humility, not, I want to make you see my perspective, but how are you seeing the situation? Help me understand your perspective. And I sat down with them and just said, like, tell me about why this feels so challenging for you. Tell me why this doesn't look like something that you want to do. And the answer that I got was, I am so busy right now and I'm so tired, and my team is so busy and tired because we have so much work to do that I just need this person to start immediately, right? And what I found out, you know, in asking that question was that the reality was that even if they had a person starting like immediately as soon as possible, that person was actually not contributing, right? Because they didn't have an onboarding plan. They didn't know how to contribute. And so it wasn't actually useful, but the manager felt like it was useful. It sort of felt more comfortable to them. It felt like, I kind of intellectually know that they're not being productive, but emotionally it feels like they're going to help my team. So, and actually the reality was that it was even worse. Not only are they not productive, they're actually taking time away from the senior team, right? And so that is so important in change management, because like I said, even a little change like that actually will make people's lives easier could be perceived a different way, because we have our intellectual brain and our emotional brain. And that's our jobs from a people side perspective, is to truly understand our people and help them see that. So I went through a process, it took a couple of weeks, but I went through a process of basically helping those engineering managers who were really against the single day hiring mentality to actually help them walk themselves through the logic that it actually wasn't working for them, that having people start whenever they wanted wasn't actually helpful for the team. So they came to that conclusion on their own. And that's actually kind of the best change management, is when people realize on their own rather than us telling them, right? So just remember from a people perspective that even a little change can be tough. And that's why this sort of iterative, rapid succession change, you know, little tiny bits is really more helpful than rolling out one giant thing, right? And this is going back to what I was talking about earlier. A lot of people, teams want it to be beautiful and perfect and all the kinks worked out of it. And that means that you're actually pushing out this bigger product, this bigger thing that people are going to have more resistance to, right? And again, it doesn't sound like it makes sense. Like, this is going to help us because you and I can see that this is a real positive thing. Onboarding is good, right? Well, you know, not everybody exactly feels that way because they don't really understand all the components that you understand, right? So these little tiny iterative changes can really help. So that is how we move forward, is engaging our team, asking questions, and doing change in little tiny bits. So I want to say thank you, but also we have a few minutes left, so I want to kind of open up for questions. But again, I'm here for you if you have questions or would like some resources on how to do this. And I'm always happy to kind of talk to you more about deeper dive engineering onboarding as well. So what's on your mind in terms of questions?
Do you have any specific examples of how to break up drip learning?
Yeah, I don't have them in this deck, but just verbally. One of the best things to do, actually, I'll scroll back to, here we go. Okay, so 4 types of knowledge. So the best thing to do is think about what context does a new hire need to really understand this environment. So like I said, you know, you can't learn item Z before you learn A, B, and C, right? So talk to your engineering manager about, well, what, you know, here's the list of things that you gave me in our first 15-minute weekly stand-up, but which of these things do they have to understand before the other one? So here's a good example of that. You cannot ship code, you can't push anything to GitHub or wherever they push code to if you don't have your development environment set up. So if you don't have your development environment set up, you can't, you know, actually do your job, right? So if you have a link that's to documentation about how to push code, but then you don't have a way for them, a link about how to set up their development environment on their local machine, then it's out of order and it's going to be confusing, right? So you've got to kind of help your engineering manager put those items back into the right order. And I would say, you know, you could even do this in a checklist if you don't have a tool to automate it. You can just kind of chunk them out into, like, here's week 1, here's what I want you to focus on in week 1, then here's week 2, you know, and then do that at least for their first 2 to 4 weeks. And that's a really good place to start.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions? Can put it in the chat too, if you need to.
I just want to say that so many light bulbs went off for me.
Oh, good.
Well, I mean, first, I think that you're right. I mean, the onboarding process should never be 100% perfect, and it should never be stagnant, right? If your company is growing and you're evolving, then so should your onboarding process. That makes complete sense to me. And the idea of communication and engagement to improve the process only makes even more sense, right? You may be in HR or in learning development, and you may not be an engineer. So why not engage someone from the engineering team to show you or tell you what is exactly needed for an engineer to be successful moving forward? And on top of that, I think it's really smart to engage the manager and the new hire in your process, because again, if your company is evolving, if your team is growing, these things will continue to change. So there's, the information that you may have given them when your company was 5 people is certainly different than the information you would give to them if your company is 50 or 250
Absolutely.
people. So I just really appreciate, I mean, it makes so much sense, but I can understand when you're in a large corporation, how it's really hard to move that ship. And, people are, especially, on engineering teams where we know with COVID-19, technology is so important. And it's one of the industries that have continued to thrive during this time. We need so much more access to technology that, hiring managers are feeling like they're drowning, right? That they need help. But what they also, if they invest the time in it now, how much more it will benefit to them, be a benefit for them later.
Absolutely.
So I just really appreciate, I mean, it all makes so much sense, it's
That's what we strive for to edify. It should make sense, right?
It should make sense. It
shouldn't be complicated. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. We just have a minute or so left, but I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk with you today. Again, if you've got questions, you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn or on email. And what I do often for folks who are on calls like this, if you have a question, I'm happy to answer it. And what I usually do is record a little Loom video for you in case I have a worksheet or something like that for you. So feel free to shoot me an email with any questions. I'm happy to help you troubleshoot. And thank you 52 Limited for hosting me as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time today. Thank you to everyone that attended. I'll be posting it on social media and or our YouTube channel. So if you need to reference anything, and I'll also send the document out in case you weren't able to save it. So thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.